schätzt als Lieben selber, doch aus dem Schätzen selber heraus redet der Wille zur Macht. Nicht der Fluss ist eure Gefahr und das
You want unshakable self-belief. You want a genius-level IQ. You want a set of killer abs. You want to walk barefoot on a beach at sunset, holding hands with the love of your life. You want a standing ovation at your Oscar acceptance speech. You want a comfortable pair of shoes. You want perfect health. You want whiter teeth. You want fresh breath confidence. You want to go vegan. You want to quit drinking. You want to make your parents proud. You want to prove wrong all those people who doubted you, pushed you around, made you feel small and treated you like a nobody. You want a brace of sparkly-eyed apple-cheeked children. You want a comfortable retirement. You want sunshine. You've been good and you deserve a lollipop. You want a fairy tale marriage. You want a bevy of filthy-minded sexual partners. You want that promotion. You want a new, more fulfilling career. You want to be CEO of a Fortune 500 company. You want a few million in the bank. You want to quit working altogether and paint watercolours. You want to watch less TV. You want a candy apple red Ferrari. You want a big slice of pepperoni pizza. You want a beautiful house with a garden in a nice neighbourhood. You want a super yacht with its own helipad. You want your own wine cellar and walk-in cigar humidor. You want to be a visionary tech entrepreneur. You want to be the toast of the art world. You want to discover a cure for cancer. You want to crack cold fusion. You want your name up in lights and an army of followers on social media. You want to bungee jump over the Grand Canyon. You want to run with the bulls in Pamplona. You want to uncover the meaning and significance of your existence. You want to help those less fortunate than yourself. You want to give something back. You want enlightenment. You want to see the face of God. You want the capital T truth. Do you think you can handle the truth? You want a little peace, quiet and time to yourself. You want it all. You want it now. You don't know what you want, and finding out what you want is all you want. In the end, above all, you just want to be happy. Christ, is that really too much to ask?
What does not kill me makes me stronger.
This is the Will to Joy podcast. Will to Joy is a resource for personal growth and transcendence based on the extraordinary teachings of Friedrich Nietzsche.
Quote, "But you yourself will always be the worst enemy you can encounter. You yourself lie in wait for yourself in caves and forests." Unquote. That's from Thus Spoke Zarathustra on the Way of the Creator. Last week I asked you, why won't you do what you want you to do? Now this may have been a bit presumptuous. Perhaps you always do what you want you to do. But if you're anything like the rest of us, you'll find that self-control, self-mastery is a real challenge. Behaviour change is hard, and we struggle to make ourselves do the things that we think we ought to do. And then we treat our lack of self-control as if it's a moral failing. Why is this? Well, consider Nietzsche's note on self-control from 1880 to 1881. Quote, "A feeling is supposed to be subdued by a thought." Unquote. So we want to eat the donut, though we're trying to be healthy, and the craving for the donut is the feeling. The reminding of oneself of one's commitment to the healthy regime and its long-term benefits is the thought, which is supposed to subdue that feeling, at least if self-control is to be achieved. Now consider a moral analogy. A feeling is supposed to be subdued by a thought. And the feeling is, in this case, I would like to steal that loaf of bread. The thought that follows is something like, but the powers that be will arrest me and put me in jail. Thereby the feeling is suppressed by a thought. And as Nietzsche would have it, it's the thought of fear, fear of the community. This is why the non-human animal is, in Nietzsche's view, more healthy than the human, as in it's more psychologically integrated. It simply follows its whims and does what it feels, at least if there's nothing in the way preventing it. And the animal respects no laws other than the laws of its instinct. Certainly, unlike the human, it feels no guilt, and it's not ashamed of what it is. I mean, animals run around with no clothes on, right? So maybe it's something a little more complicated than that. We can be conditioned to see theft just as a wrong in itself. And of course we are. But it's less easy to hold on to such a moral conviction, no matter how intensive the social programming we've been exposed to, if you have no money and if your family is starving. But let's leave the moral mire for another of our excursions. This time we're talking about self-overcoming, following on from last week's show. And last time we explored the fragmentary nature of our desires, the fact that belief in a single unified you controlling everything is misleading. Instead, as Walt Whitman put it, quote, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." Unquote. In Nietzsche's view, your unconscious psychology comprises countless drives, all vying to express themselves through your choices, your behaviour, and even your emotions and thoughts. This is his drive psychology. Every drive is a will to power, inasmuch as it exists and strives to express itself. And every drive has a history, a genealogy, as Nietzsche calls it, that explains why it exists. And it always exists because at some point in your life, or in the development of your species, it was useful. In some cases, however, its usefulness may have ended. Remember also that the relative power of these drives fluctuates too. Let's say you've been trying to reduce alcohol and you are more motivated after you've been to your AA meeting. But then a bad day at work makes your desire for a drink much, much stronger. So that drive to drink is stronger and weaker at different times, depending on your circumstances. And last week we discussed that you always do what you want, but you can want many things at the same time and they can be in direct conflict with each other. The drives can be an unruly rabble. If this sounds bad, remember too that for Nietzsche, this psychological division, tension and jostling is just what thinking is. Will you study for that exam or will you watch TV? The battle between these two drives is experienced as you mulling over what to do, agonising, your internal dialogue to and fro. In this case, it would be, say, a drive to get some qualifications and get on in the world, wrestling with a more immediate desire for comfort, pleasure, and the will to avoid unpleasant effort. And remember, it's this relentless internal dialogue, an epiphenomenon of the battling drives, that gives you, in Nietzsche's view, a sense of having a unified psychological self, an ego. Your self is a dynamic aggregate of your churning drives. Now, this is quite ironic because it's a product of the many selves struggling with each other. When it comes to your conscious self, your ego, there is no you apart from the community of drives. The problem in a nutshell is that you think of yourself as a unity, an individual, as a single person with a single will. And our society and our culture does everything it can to reinforce this sense of an integrated, unified, autonomous self. Indeed, its entire survival depends on this mythology. In truth, you are nothing of the sort. You are something much more complicated, diversified, disordered, and marvellous. What you lack is understanding. What is missing is organisation. What you need is some leadership. Will to Joy is a new and tender green shoot striving towards the light. If it's going to thrive, it needs the sunshine and gentle rain of your support. If you find value here, support me by doing a few simple things. Hit follow so you don't miss the next episode. Follow Will to Joy on all the main social media platforms. Drop the podcast a review. I'd love to hear your feedback. If you know people who get something from this material, please do share it with them. And please consider supporting me in this project for a few dollars a month. There's a link in the show's description. And if you feel ready for it, you can now also become a De Profundis member on Patreon with exclusive episodes that delve deeper into Nietzsche's philosophy for life. Link also in the show's description. Your support will ensure that I can keep producing the Will to Joy podcast to support you in your own flourishing. Thank you. Last week we also talked about Nietzsche's formula for eliminating or controlling bad habits too. And he had 6 methods. Firstly, avoid the temptation. Secondly, ration yourself. Thirdly, overindulge to the point of disgust. Fourthly, create a negative association with the habit that you're trying to change. Fifthly, diversion. So diverting the attention and the energy from the bad habit into a new habit instead. And sixth, exhaustion, which is probably the most inadvisable of the lot because that involves weakening your entire constitution. So that's one that we won't be recommending today. As Nietzsche says, we do not have some objective detached ability to stand back and choose to overcome our bad habits. When we do so successfully, it's because we have another drive that prevails, the drive to overcome, to make the future better than the past. Now, we may all be at the mercy of our drives, but as you are listening to this podcast, you probably want to make positive changes. So you have a drive to self-overcome, to master your unruly drives, the drives that undermine your health and your success. The first principle for effective behaviour change is not willpower. And this may surprise you as we are dealing with the philosophy of Nietzsche's will to power. But as Nietzsche says, it's something about subtlety and self-outwitting. Quote, shrewdness, clarity, severity and logicality as weapons against the ferocity of the drives. Unquote. And that's from Will to Power 433. Sure, there's always an element of self-discipline, but the more you strategize, the less you need to rely on iron willpower. And when you strategize, what you're trying to do is make it as easy as possible for you to do the right things and as difficult as possible to do the wrong things. This is about planning ahead of time and creating the choice architecture that will most likely produce the results you want. So surround yourself with only the right options. So if you're trying to give up donuts, don't have donuts in the house. And if you're trying to stop bringing donuts into the house, eat a substantial meal before you go shopping, and so you're less likely to pluck them off the supermarket shelves. In this example, you've removed a temptation at home for when the donut chomping drive makes its appearance. A piece of simple choice architecture. And you've subdued that same drive by quelling your appetite before you expose yourself to the temptation of buying donuts. Simple and effective. But it requires forethought, planning and organisation. And of course, some commitment too. And you need to watch out for self-sabotage because the mind is adept at rationalising unhelpful behaviours. You think, oh, I'll get some donuts in case I have visitors. And then inevitably you eat them all yourself. So watch out for rationalisations. That's exactly what your rationality is for. At times, thinking can be decidedly unhelpful when it comes to self-control. Nietzsche calls this a war against oneself. But if you don't like this metaphor, consider an orchestra of virtuoso musicians, but who are all playing their own tune. Chaos. We want them to work together, each coming in to play their part only when the symphony requires it. All playing the same score, in the same key, and all their instruments in tune with each other. Sure, one or two of them may need firing as well, of course. Consider the drive for self-overcoming that we're trying to isolate as the conductor of the orchestra. Let's call this drive for self-overcoming the master drive, because its main function is to master the whole collection of drives, to provide leadership for them. Now, this talk of drives is a little artificial because, as I've said, what you think of as you is just the sum of the activity of your drives. So you probably never experience the unalloyed effects of a single drive making decisions. But you do experience the effects of one or more dominant drives there in the mix at any point in time, because they are the ones that are expressed in your thoughts, choices, and behaviour. We want your master drive to be the dominant drive. Now, Nietzsche's drive psychology is sometimes criticised for positing drives as little intelligences, gremlins, or spirits trying to figure out how to get what they want, how to get their own way. But that's not it at all. Though the drives are plastic in being able to adapt and respond to opportunities for expression, and though they seem to exhibit cleverness or intelligence, this is not to say that they are individually conscious. They're more like complex reflexes. One of my favourite Nietzsche academics is John Richardson, and I'm going to quote him from his book Nietzsche's New Darwinism, which is excellent, by the way. Discussing their plasticity and responsiveness, he writes, quote, "Such plasticity depends on a capacity to respond to circumstances, which requires being able to sense them in some minimal way. But this way can be very minimal indeed. On this pared-down notion of drives, even a plant's phototropism can count as one. It shows a plastic responsiveness to a light source, even though this consists in nothing more than the tendency of the leader to grow more quickly on the shaded side. It's in terms of such minimal units as these plastic dispositions that Nietzsche means to build his naturalism of drives. It lets him find drives, and thereby values, very widely in all life, yet without anthropomorphizing them as psychic states." Unquote. So to illustrate his point, cover a plant with a rock, and often within a few days you may see that plant emerging from beneath the rock, finding its way around it to reach the sunlight. The plant finds its way around obstacles even though it has no intelligence and no goal. But it looks like it has intelligence, almost as if it knows the obstacle is there and is feeling its way around it, testing and adjusting with its tendrils. And boy, does it look like it has a goal to reach the sunlight. Yet it's just acting mechanically. Its will to power, to take that concept in its broad sense, is written into its physiology. It behaves as it does because that's been the formula for success in propagating genes in its genetic ancestors. It is not conscious in the way we normally use the word, and our drives are analogous to the plant in this respect. The drive in human psychology is itself a metaphor. In fact, Nietzsche definitely doesn't believe the drives are things in themselves because he doesn't even believe in things. Yes, so a more abstruse inquiry for another occasion. We won't get into that one now. But better to consider your drives as complexes of behaviour that must seek expression, that have evolved or been learned to express themselves. Or another metaphor. Think of them as blind currents in a roiling pool. Some are stronger than others and can overwhelm the competition, but the boundaries of any current may not be particularly distinct. In fact, they aren't particularly distinct. But its force and its trajectory is unmistakable. We see these effects in our behaviour all the time. So I'm going to give an overview of some scientifically evidence-based techniques that support positive behaviour change. So firstly, Nietzsche writes, quote, "Weakness of will. This is a fable that can lead astray, for there is no will. Consequently, neither a strong nor a weak one. The multiplicity and disintegration of the instincts, the want of a system in their relationship, constitute what is known as weak will. Their coordination, under the government of one individual among them, results in a strong will. In the first case, vacillation and a lack of equilibrium is noticeable. In the second, precision and definite direction." Unquote. That's from Will to Power 46. What does Nietzsche mean here by no will? He means the struggle between your drives determines your will. Your will is just what happens to be the dominant drive right now. You might consider the implications of this for that perennial philosophical question of free will, and we'll get to that in due course. As he says, the government of one individual among the drives constitutes the strong will. That's what we are calling the master drive. So, to the behaviour change techniques. First of all, journaling. Journaling is very popular these days. It's a way of recording your thoughts and reflections. Sometimes you don't really know what you think about something until you start to write it down or explain it to somebody. So it can help sort out that jumble of thoughts and feelings and impressions. Journaling creates accountability, particularly when you've got specific goals or objectives that you're trying to achieve. And remember, the self, as we've described it, is protean and changeable, so that you may find that your desires drift over time. And a journal is a good way of capturing that and being able to spot that drift. A journal helps you analyse your priorities and record your successes, and also analyse and learn from your failures. And it's a good way of processing your experiences. The only shortcoming with journaling, I would say from experience, is that there's something about translating your experience into words that can simplify and even falsify it to a certain extent. The fact is, our feelings and our emotions and the way we feel about events, it's not always rational, and it's not always communicable, and it's not always specific. But journaling requires you to make those ambiguous feelings into something intelligible. And in that sense, you have to be careful that you are not misrepresenting the experience when you record it. So an eye on that. And I would advise actually trying not to be too rational when journaling. Engaging doodling, drawing pictures, cut things out and stick them in if necessary, but keep it a little bit freestyle and entertain the fact that you won't always know how you feel about everything, and you won't always be able to put it into words either. But that said, journaling is extremely helpful in behaviour change, and I commend that practice to you. Now, we've already talked about creating the conditions for success. We discussed the donut, not having the donut in the house, not buying the donut at the supermarket. And these are ways of moulding your choice architecture such that when the crunch time comes, you make the right choice instead of the wrong choice. So a classic example from my career is helping people quit smoking. Normally they would set a quit date about a week in advance, and they would spend that week in preparation getting ready for the quit day. And that involved creating the right environment for a non-smoker in their own homes. So getting rid of ashtrays and cigarettes and lighters, planning replacement behaviours. Obviously, there's a real hand-to-mouth element with smoking. And so when those cravings hit, it's good to have a replacement behaviour that can, if not satisfy, somewhat alleviate the cravings. So a classic would be carrot sticks or crudités to munch on when the craving hits. It's really important to change routines for behaviour change as well, because so many of our habits are environmentally situated and environmentally triggered. So you need to change that environment. Do things at different times. Drink tea instead of coffee. Just little changes to habits that make your day unfamiliar. Closely related to creating the conditions for success is planning. And planning is really important with any project. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that. And it's important to plan with SMART steps. So that's the old acronym of specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timed. But your plan shouldn't just encompass goals. It should also be about processes too. You're trying to embed new, helpful habits, not just aspire to specific goals with some definite end point. Planning can also help you record and analyse the assets that will support you in your ambitions and the counter forces that are going to drag you down and get in your way. And you can come up with strategies and tactics for dealing with those counter forces, for mitigating their impact, and also for supercharging any assets that you might have. So planning, again, very important and something that you would need to review regularly. Planning makes your ambitions salient, as does journaling, and salience is really important. So what we're talking about when we discuss salience is making something really vivid in your everyday life. Whatever it is you are trying to achieve, you need to constantly be reminding yourself of its priority, the fact that you've chosen it to be something significant in your life. So you might do this by creating little notes, little post-its that you put around the house, reminding you of the behaviour that you're trying to change or the goal that you're trying to achieve. For instance, if you're trying to cut down on snacking, you might put a little post-it note on the fridge reminding you of your commitment. You might change the screensaver on your smartphone or on your laptop. You might even come up with some affirmations that you repeat to yourself several times a day. Any sort of signs or symbols that can just make it so much more vivid for you in terms of what you're trying to achieve. Let's say you're saving for your kids. Well, then you might have a photograph of your children on the box in which you're saving the money. Although I'm not sure how many people save money in a box anymore. It's probably not advisable. But yeah, anything that can remind you and anything that can refortify your commitment to what you're trying to do, because your commitment will waver over time. As we've discussed, you are changeable. Sometimes something's really important at one moment, and then 20 minutes later or an hour later, you've moved on and there's other things that are further up your list of priorities. It can also be helpful to envision your drives, the unhelpful drives, as bullies or enemies. So for instance, if you find yourself scrolling on your phone all the time, and that's something you want to reduce, you might personify this habit as scroll on. So scroll on is a little demon, a little bully or an enemy that you are trying to vanquish. And so the benefit of this, of course, is every time you engage in the behaviour, if you've embedded that image in your mind, it will occur to you and you'll just become much more aware of the fact that you are engaging in the habit. And that does work, actually. In fact, there's a whole methodology of monitoring and identifying your more subtle drives, though we don't really have time to get into that here. But if you're interested in that, drop me a message through your podcast platform or do take a look at the Patreon if that interests you. Another really powerful way of ensuring that behaviour change is successful is enlisting social support and making a public commitment. So by this I mean, if you're trying to quit smoking, it's really helpful if the people in your home know that you're trying to quit smoking. And that means that they're going to, hopefully, if they're a loving family, they're going to support you in that. So that means encouraging you, validating your successes. If they're smokers, not smoking around you, because that's a real moment of relapse for smokers. And as well as that, making a public commitment. Well, if you've ever read the book by Robert Cialdini about the psychology of influence, commitment is one of the main means of influencing people as far as he's concerned. If you can get somebody to commit to something publicly, they're more likely to stick with it. And that's because in our culture and in human psychology, we put great store in commitment and consistency, in people doing what they say they're going to do. In fact, it's the basis of our entire moral and legal system. In fact, you could go so far as to say that it's the basis of all civilization. I would say that commitment is one of the most lauded and valued virtues in human society. And we can see why, because it's conducive to the smooth and orderly running of a community. And Nietzsche references commitment in one of his aphorisms from Human All Too Human, number 548. Quote, "If we can force people to declare themselves publicly for something, we have usually also brought them to the point of declaring themselves for it privately. They want to continue to be perceived as consistent." Unquote. If I reflect on the stop smoking services we used to provide, we would run clinics, and as part of the clinic, we would get people at their first meeting to stand up once they'd made a pledge to quit smoking and make a public commitment in front of the entire group, saying that they would not smoke for the next 7 days until the next meeting. And that was found to be very effective. People don't want others to think that they are flaky in any way. So commitment is really important, making that public commitment. If you want to make a behaviour change and you find yourself reluctant to make a public commitment about it, assuming it's not something inherently embarrassing, you want to ask yourself whether you are really committed to that behaviour change or not. Again, just be careful of rationalizations with this. Another technique for effective behaviour change is reframing. So let's say you want to go to the gym. Like the original framing, the unhelpful framing might be something like, I have to go to the gym because I'm getting fat and lazy. Or I have to go to the gym because I've paid my subscription. So to reframe that into something more constructive and more motivating, we might change it to something like, I'm choosing to go to the gym because I feel more energized and mentally sharp when I move my body. So why does this work? Well, the original framing is shame-based and it's focused on avoidance of being overweight and of being lazy and of paying for a gym membership that you're not using. The reframed version is approach-oriented and rooted in positive identity and intrinsic motivation, more energy, more clarity. It also shifts the locus of control from obligation to choice. So reframing can be really, really helpful. And of course, we've got a Nietzsche quote that talks about reframing as well. In The Joyous Science 3 or 4, he writes, quote, in doing, we leave undone. In the main, all those moral systems are distasteful to me which say, do not do this, renounce, overcome yourself. On the other hand, I am favourable to those moral systems which stimulate me to do something, and to do it again from morning till evening, to dream of it at night, and to think of nothing else but to do it well as is possible for me alone. For him who so lives, there fall off one after the other the things that do not pertain to such a life, without hatred or antipathy. He sees this take leave of him today and that tomorrow, like the yellow leaves which every livelier breeze strips from the tree. Or he does not see at all that they take leave of him. So firmly is his eye fixed upon his goal, and generally forward, not sideways, backward, or downward. Our doing must determine what we leave undone. In that we do, we leave undone. Unquote. And if that sounds a bit complicated, what he's saying is if you focus on what you want to do rather than what you shouldn't do, this is more inherently motivated. And if you focus on what you want to do rather than what the alternative, which is what you shouldn't do, you'll find that you are not doing what you shouldn't do by virtue of the fact that you are doing what you want to do. I hope that's not confusing. But essentially, what Nietzsche's saying is that we should focus on what we want to do, the person we want to be, the changes we want to implement, rather than focusing on what we shouldn't do, on the person that we're trying not to be, the things we're trying to overcome. So this is about reframing as like something positive. What is it we want? Not what is it we don't want? So that's reframing. Another technique that can be effective, and I've alluded to it already with the carrot sticks as a replacement for smoking, is substitutions. So you're taking something away, but you must replace it with something else. So people who replace a bad habit with a good one are really good examples here. It's a distraction, it's a diversion, it's a complete alternative to the unhealthy behaviour that you're trying to overcome. And I'm particularly aware of like a case, one of my girlfriend's friends who was effectively a functioning alcoholic, who was drinking nearly every night, and who flipped that and became an obsessive marathon runner, to the point actually that people were worrying about how much he was running marathons. But I'm sure you'd agree that running too many marathons is probably preferable to drinking yourself into a stupor every night. So substitution, if you take something away, there will be a gap in somebody's life. That's the fact. In drug treatment services, when people used to quit drugs or reduce drugs, there was often a real sense of grief at having lost something that was valuable and enjoyable for all the downsides that it brought as well. And so in order to help alleviate that grief, it's really, really helpful to provide some kind of substitution, some alternative. And if it can be a healthy and a positive one, even better. Now, another technique for effective behaviour change is so-called virtue pairing. So this is where you take an activity that might be laborious or tedious or just hard to motivate yourself towards, and you pair it with something you enjoy to provide a compensation, as it were. So, classic one here, for me, when I used to go running early in the morning before work, especially in winter when it was dark and wet and cold, I really didn't want to go for that run, but there was a couple of podcasts that I really enjoyed. And I confined myself to listening to these podcasts only when I went for the run. So in as much as I didn't want to go out and do my run in the morning, I did want to listen to the podcast, and it helped me overcome that hurdle and get out and start pounding the streets early in the morning. So that's a good example of virtue pairing. But I heard of somebody else on a podcast, incidentally, who only drank whiskey whilst they were doing the ironing once a week. Now, they really enjoyed whiskey. That was a behaviour that they were trying to reduce, of course, excessive alcohol consumption. But also, they were doing the ironing, and that was a task that they didn't particularly relish or look forward to either. So, they paired the two together. And naturally, they came to look forward to doing the ironing because it became associated with that pleasurable activity of having a couple of glasses of whiskey. So virtue pairing is another excellent strategy and piece of self-outwitting that will enable you to change some of your behaviours. So let's talk about sublimation. Sublimation is the redirecting of negative energy into a positive channel, economizing it, as Nietzsche might say. So this is it's a little bit like substitution. In fact, there's a bit of overlap between several of these techniques. But say, for instance, you've had a terrible day at work. You feel absolutely furious. Your boss has given you loads of new work to do. Perhaps you didn't get the promotion and you come back feeling furious. Well, you can take out that fury on a punch bag, for instance. So that would be sublimating that angry energy into something that is arguably positive, because if you've ever worked a punch bag for 5 minutes, you will know just how exhausting that is. So there's a really good bit of a way of venting your anger, but also of doing something that's good for your physical fitness. And let's face it, it's better than taking your anger and frustration out on your partner. And you might channel emotions such as despair or depression into artworks, into painting or into sculpture. And of course, lots of artists historically have discussed channeling their sexual libido into creative works too. So these are all examples of sublimation. And of course, Nietzsche has a quote to go with this from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Quote, "At last, all your passions have become virtues, and all your devils angels. Once you had fierce dogs in your cellar, but they changed at last into birds and sweet singers." Unquote. So Nietzsche is talking there specifically about sublimating the animal instincts, which to a great extent our civilization requires us to bottle up and stifle. We'll discuss more about that in another podcast. But let's move on now. One of the most amusing techniques for promoting positive behaviour change, what Nietzsche calls riding a stupid ass. So let's begin with the quote. Quote, "To freely have or not have your emotions, your for and against, to seat yourself on them as you would on a horse, or often as you would on an ass, since you need to know how to employ their stupidity as well as their fire." Unquote. That's from Beyond Good and Evil 284. So what does he mean by this? Riding a horse or a stupid ass? So a nice example of riding a stupid ass would be something like, let's say at school you had a teacher who told you you would never amount to anything. Obviously, this is quite upsetting and probably would make you quite angry. And as you get on in later life, even though this was years ago in your career or in whatever field you're trying to aspire in, the words of that teacher still ring in your ears such that they motivate you. And part of your motivation to get on in your career is to take revenge on that teacher who thought so poorly of your potential. So in this instance, your revenge on that teacher would be the stupid ass. It's something that most of us would say is like silly and should be forgotten. And yet how you feel is a very real part of your life. And so by channeling that anger into productive motivation to help you achieve, what you've done is use that stupid ass as a means to get something that you want. So your desire for revenge, as fatuous as it might be, is useful. And so you ride that ass, or the horse in the case of more noble motivations, employing their stupidity, as Nietzsche says, as well as their fire. So again, there's quite some overlap there with sublimation. You're taking that negative energy and you're using it for a positive end. And then let's talk about perspectivism, which is very dear to Nietzsche's heart. Nietzsche thinks that we've all got our own unique perspectives informed by our own needs and experiences and interests. And perspective is flexible. We have different perspectives at different times. We can zoom in and zoom out. But in terms of behaviour change, we might try to adjust our perspectives a little bit like we did with the reframing by remembering positive things and actively trying to forget negative things. So let's say we remember our successes and we celebrate those successes. We squeeze all the juice out. We make a big deal out of them. We write them up in great detail in our journal and we make them bigger psychically. They become more significant within our minds and within our realities. And then with failures, we learn from those failures. We conduct our analysis, we do our post-mortem, and we see what can be learned. We, again, squeeze the juice out, get all the value out of the experience, and then we discard it. We actively forget it. We might even write it down and then tear it up and throw it in a fire or something like that, symbolically getting rid of it. So what we're doing is we're retaining a positive perspective. So again, very much in the same ballpark as reframing. Something else that's really important to remember is that you are going to have your failures. You're going to have lapses, but it's really crucial to not allow a lapse to become a relapse. This is in fact very common. And it often happens with drinking and smoking, for instance. So say you've been off the fags for 2 weeks and then you happen to have a cigarette and then you think, oh, well, I might as well throw in the towel. I'm a failure. I didn't do it. And you just go back to smoking. It happens all the time. And the same with alcohol as well, not least because alcohol is a disinhibitor. So once you've had one drink, you're more likely to have another drink. If you have a lapse, as unfortunate as that is, it's an opportunity to do a little learning and stick with the program. Don't let the lapse become a relapse, a really important principle. So prepare for relapses, expect them, expect failures, and have little strategies to deal with them. Don't let that one cigarette become a return to smoking. Don't let that one drink become a return to drinking all the time. Don't rip it up and start again. Learn and keep going. For our next couple of behaviour change techniques, we're going to jump back a few thousand years to ancient Greece. And as you know, if you listen to this podcast, Nietzsche was a big fan of ancient Greek culture. So this next technique for behaviour change is cultivating the sacred agon. Agon is a Greek word that means contest, struggle or conflict, but not just in the physical sense. It refers to any structured form of competition or confrontation, which is often seen as a necessary driver of excellence and growth or transformation. In ancient Greek culture, agon was everywhere. It was in the athletics, like the Olympic Games. It was in theatre, with opposing characters or ideas clashing on stage. In philosophy, of course, through debate and dialectic. and even in politics and in war, as noble rivals strove for glory and contended with each other. But agon isn't merely about winning. It was about proving oneself, sharpening one's virtues through resistance. It was the sacred engine of becoming. And for Nietzsche, it was actually the engine of excellence in Greek culture, because they embraced this sense of productive competition so wholly. He sees agon as the crucible in which higher types are forged, not by avoiding struggle, but by actively engaging in it. In fact, in his concept of the will to power, we can see the agon. Life asserts itself through confrontation and overcoming, and through facing resistance. So when we talk about cultivating the sacred agon, we're talking about embracing rivalry, not with bitterness, but as a way of becoming more than you are. Agon necessarily involves failure, because if you're going to compete in any kind of competition worth winning, there has to be a significant risk of losing, and so you will lose more than you win. That's just the nature of the beast, and it should be embraced. So we take the competition seriously, but when we lose, we're not crestfallen, we don't give up. It's all part of the journey. So we compete, and we compete to win, and we take it seriously, but we don't take it too seriously. Not if we lose, anyway. So the ancient Greeks had a name for the spirit of rivalry, Eris, a god, in fact. But Eris was not all good. There was good Eris, the kind that drives us to greatness, and there was bad Eris, the kind that leads to war and destruction and death. Let's make an idol of good Eris. This isn't about tearing others down. It's about using competition as fuel. Think of sports or skill building, your career, any field where excellence matters. Pick someone just ahead of you, someone whose progress makes you itch to catch up. Or better, someone who looks like they're about to overtake you. Let them crack the whip behind you, not with resentment, but with a bit of fire. Engage with other people who are chasing the same goals and try to outdo them. Again, not out of malice, but out of honour, out of the sacred desire to grow. We can all push each other towards excellence. And when you fail, because you will fail, let that be the proof that you're trying. If you're not failing, you're not reaching far enough. You're just plateauing. Nobody at the top got there through unending victories. It was always failure after failure after failure until something breaks through. So revere the struggle. Honour the sacred agon. Don't be discouraged by failures. Compete like your life depends on it, and lose like it teaches you how to win. So the last thing I'm going to mention in terms of productive, healthy behaviour change today is the formula of Saturnalia. So Saturnalia is, again, something that Nietzsche takes from the Greeks, in as much as opposed to Christian culture, where we repress and deny the drives that we find embarrassing or socially dangerous, things like aggression and lust. Instead of denying them, they're given proper vent. So they can be sublimated, they can be expressed, for instance, agon. Aggression can be expressed through agon, structured forms of competition, but also lust too is given its due. So Saturnalia is a kind of little holiday for your drives. All the drives that are normally too unruly, normally too socially dangerous or embarrassing to express, are allowed to express themselves at a given time in a given place. And you can even do this with bad habits. And this ties into one of Nietzsche's behaviour change formulas, of course, which is rationing. So let's say you allow yourself to gorge on ice cream once a month, just as a way of scratching that particular itch, but without capitulating completely, and so ending up overweight and obese again. So now this comes with risks. Saturnalia, of course it does. So for instance, we talked about relapsing with smoking and drinking. They're real risks. I would actually recommend that some habits are not suitable for Saturnalia, and smoking is definitely one of them. There was a guy who wrote a book on quitting smoking some years ago called Alan Carr, and his method of success was actually pretty effective, but he had this metaphor, which I think is really, really on the money when it comes to smoking. When you stop smoking, there's a demon on your shoulder that starts to shrink. And the longer you go without cigarettes, the smaller and smaller it gets and the less and less power it has over you. Of course, that demon is your addiction to nicotine. But what stops the demon shrinking and starts it growing again is having another cigarette. So even if you have the one cigarette, the demon suddenly starts to get bigger. And so your risk of relapse increases. Therefore, it's really not wise to have a cigarette if you've successfully quit smoking for a period of time. And in fact, that is a major cause of relapse. People think, well, I haven't smoked for 6 months. I'm no longer a smoker. I'm at a party. I'll just have the one. And what do you know? They end up smoking again, back on 40 a day. I've seen it happen time and time again. So again, Saturnalia, to be approached with caution. But as always, music. Nietzsche, as you well know by now, is the philosopher of music, of art, of the aesthetic, of emotion. And so I'm recommending a music track in every show. And this week's track is I Want to Be Alone by Jackson C. Franklin. This song is a tender guitar folk ballad, evoking the atmosphere of the English folk tradition. The vocals are soft, melancholic and intimate. It's a meditation on solitude and desired isolation. For me, it's about introspection and perhaps about mortality too. It feels very profound and even unsettling. There's a real sense of the artist's vulnerability. This track was recorded in 1965 and it's sometimes given the alternate title of Dialogue. Jackson C. Frank lived a life marked by tragedy and loss. As I understand it, he suffered enormous childhood trauma after his school burned down, with him being the only survivor, though he was severely burned and scarred for life. In later life, he actually suffered from mental illness and actually became homeless, in light of which this song takes on extra resonance. There's a real sense of a soul in pain in this track. I'd say there's even something quite ghostly about this song. So check it out and let me know your views. So there's a bunch of pro tips on self-overcoming. It's not a complete structured program, but I may produce one in future. Contact me if you're interested. And also check the Patreon De Profundis account. There's a lot more resources and material over there to put together your own behaviour change program. Now, I wanted to cover suffering this week, but as we've already overrun, I'm going to save that for next time, as it's a big, juicy topic with a great deal of scope and something not to be rushed. You've probably gleaned already that for Nietzsche, suffering is a really important topic, and so let's give it its due. But I'll leave you with this thought from Nietzsche, and this is from Human All Too Human 560. Quote, "What we are free to do. We can act as the gardeners of our impulses, and, which few people know, we may cultivate the seeds of anger, pity, vanity, or excessive brooding, and make these things fecund and productive, just as we can train a beautiful plant to grow along trellis work. We may do this with the good taste or bad taste of a gardener, as it were, in the French, English, Dutch, or Chinese style. We may let nature take its own course, only trimming and embellishing a little here and there, and finally, without any knowledge or consideration, we may even allow the plants to spring up in accordance with their own natural growth and limitations, and fight out their battle amongst themselves. Nay, we can even take delight in such chaos, though we may possibly have a hard time with it. All this is at our option, but how many know that it is? Do not the majority of people believe in themselves as complete and perfect facts? And have not the great philosophers set their seal on this prejudice through their doctrine of the unchangeability of character?" Unquote. So, you are not a fact. You're more like a story, or in this metaphor, a garden. And in that garden, All the plants are your various drives, battling it out for space, for light and nutrients and moisture. So, are you going to tend that garden? Are you going to make it into something beautiful? He mentions the unchangeability of character at the end of the aphorism there, and for him that's a nonsense. It's probably an allusion to the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. The truth is your character is changing all the time, in ways great and small. Nothing stands still. Everything is becoming something else. Will to power is to want to become something better than you have been and now are. You are becoming something. What are you becoming? What do you want to become?